Hi, my name is June. I'm an alcoholic. And thank you so much for inviting me to be part of your group. Thank you, David, and thank you to the group. Um, I guess, I was thinking whenever someone mentions my tape or CD, I know one time I was talking in person in Seattle and a guy stood in line and he thanked me for my talk that night, but he said I was even better on CD. So that could be the way that you feel after this. You might want to look me up online instead. I want to welcome anyone who might be new to Alcoholics Anonymous or who might be visiting. I know that at different times I've had friends or family members who have wanted to sit in on a meeting, especially during the pandemic. And so I never know who's really here listening. And so I like to start out when I'm asked to share for this long by making sure that I say the very most important things that I ever say when I'm asked to share in a meeting for a lengthy period of time. I say them in the beginning because I know when I was new, I couldn't always listen to everything that the speakers were saying. They do tend to go on and on. And I'm sure if you're new, you're going to feel exactly that way tonight. So I try to say the most important things right now. And then you don't have to necessarily listen to the rest. So the most important thing that I would tell you is that I'm not an expert on anything at all. I'm not an expert on alcoholism, on Alcoholics Anonymous, on any page in the big book, on any step or anything at all. I'm simply a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. I've been asked to stop by tonight and share my experience, strength, and hope to the best of my ability, and that's what I'm going to try and do. The other thing that I like to make sure that people know, because people come to Alcoholics Anonymous in many ways, they've always come to Alcoholics Anonymous in many ways, sometimes through a doctor, often through a family member, sometimes through a minister or a rabbi, sometimes through judges, a lot of different ways that people come. But more and more through the years, more and more people do come into Alcoholics Anonymous through some type of a hospital or some type of program. I really don't think it matters how anybody gets to Alcoholics Anonymous. But sometimes I have learned over the years that people get a little bit confused about which part is the hospital or the program and which part's Alcoholics Anonymous. And so what I want to let you know, if you're new or visiting, I want you to know that Alcoholics Anonymous is absolutely free. And if it had not been free, I could not have come to Alcoholics Anonymous. And if it had not stayed free, I could not have stayed. I was over 10 years sober in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous before I could afford to put a dollar in the basket at the seventh tradition. And I haven't always been able to put a dollar in the basket since I was 10 years sober. Again, one time I had talked at a meeting and a woman came up to me and she said, "I heard you when I was new." And I'll tell you, there's something very special when someone comes up and says that to you, that they remember something from when they were new that you said. And she said, "I remember I was sitting in the meeting and you said you'd been sober over 10 years before you could put a dollar in the basket." And she said, "And I thought, what a loser." So you never know how something you share in a meeting is going to stick with somebody, may not be in the way that you thought it would. I do tend to jump around and I'm a little bit tired. Right now I'm going through some extra occupational therapy because I had a couple of surgeries a few weeks ago. So I'm a little worn out. And so I always have a tendency to jump around though anyway. So I'm a little bit like a dog in a Disney movie. And if I see a squirrel in my thoughts, I'm just going to go in that direction. So again, I like to try and say a few things in the very beginning so that at least hopefully people hear that. And what I want to let you know is that I've had a psychic change as a result of practicing the principles that I've learned here in Alcoholics Anonymous. And by that, I include not only the steps, but I include the traditions and the concepts and the things that I have learned here through service in Alcoholics Anonymous. And because of that psychic change, I don't live the way that I used to live. I remember very clearly some of those old timers saying in meetings when I was new, "You don't ever have to drink again if you don't want to. You don't ever have to live the way that you've been living if you don't want to. And we know a way to help you do that. And we can share that experience." And, very much like Karen said in the very beginning when she was suggesting if anybody's got something going on that they stick around at the end of the meeting, to chat. I have been sober a significant period of time. And I have a pretty good imagination as well. I don't think there's a single situation that I can think of that I have not watched someone in Alcoholics Anonymous walk through, and stay sober through. And many of them, I assure you, have done it with far more dignity than I would do or have done sometimes as I've walked through my own bumps in the road. I am a person who believes I was born an alcoholic. Certainly is not an important issue, something that I believe. There was definitely something wrong with me way before alcohol began to be a part of my life. I did grow up in an alcoholic home. I did grow up with a lot of violence. I grew up with a lot of abuse. I grew up with a lot of broken promises that often happen in alcoholic homes. And by the time I was 5 years old, I didn't even want to be here anymore. I was done. I wanted a way out. And I began to search for a way out. And I found different ways out, but they didn't really last. Interestingly enough, I was going to find out years later that they were going to call the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous The Way Out, until they found out there were several other books that were already called that. So they named it Alcoholics Anonymous. But again, I want to assure you, if you are new, that the program of Alcoholics Anonymous that has been shared with me throughout these years, it has proven to be a way out from the way that I used to live and act and think. And I'm extremely grateful for that. So I started to drink on a regular basis when I was 8 years old. I had already been using other chemicals for over a year at that time that I mixed with that. And I had never, that I recall, liked anything about myself. I didn't like being tall. I didn't like being skinny. I didn't like having curly red hair. I didn't like the family that I was in. I didn't like the town that I was in. I didn't like going to 18 grammar schools, 7 junior highs, and 5 high schools, and only finishing 7th grade. Um, I was never comfortable. And so, somebody like me, I'm extremely grateful that alcohol and some of the things that I mixed with it worked the way that it did, because life always hurt way too much for me, just way too much. And and so I'm very grateful, because I really think if alcohol hadn't given me an occasional brief time away from how much I hated myself and hated life and hated the world, um, I think I would have had to been locked up in some kind of an institution, and I just don't think I could have made it, without that. So I am very, very grateful that it worked. I grew up in a little town in Los Angeles called Venice. My mother was a bar drinker. She drank in extremely violent bars. That was part of what went on in the neighborhood that I grew up in. And so, as a kid, I've seen men stabbed and shot, and I've seen them die, and I've seen them get beaten up. I saw their kids overdose. I saw their wives leave them. And I saw the women in my life go through all of those same experiences when I was growing up. But I did see a difference the way I remember it. And that's not necessarily the way that it is. But I've come to see that, of course, over the years. But the way I remember it, I don't ever remember a man shedding a tear under any of those circumstances. And I believed until long after I was sober in Alcoholics Anonymous, I believe that the reason that men could see all those things happen and not shed a tear was because they didn't feel pain. I thought all men felt was anger, and that's how I wanted to be, because I seemed to always feel pain. And to a certain extent, alcohol allowed me to really just live with anger. But I had a lot of hostility. I had a lot of anger. I was in a gang. I did a lot of fighting. However, I always like to mention I've never won a fight in my life. I've never fought less than 5 people at a time. I found in my life, and again, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not an expert. I'm telling you what I've found in hindsight. I found in my life, because I was so sensitive and because life always hurt so much, that I would much rather someone punch me in my face than hurt my feelings. And so I had a way of interacting with people so that there would be violence, and so that I would get slugged rather than they could get to know me and tease me or make fun of how I looked or how I was acting or what I was wearing. And so that's just kind of the way that I lived my life. Alcohol worked for quite a while. It helped me not care, and I was an over carer. So to not care gave me a lot of freedom. But if you don't care and you hate yourself and the world as much as I did, then by the time you get to Alcoholics Anonymous, you'll know exactly what they mean when they talk about pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization. I I didn't want to breathe in and out anymore. I hated everything in my life so much by the time I came through the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous. My mother was an alcoholic. My mother was a person who was going to be in and out of Alcoholics Anonymous for over 40 years with various periods of sobriety. My mom passed away about 2 years ago now, and when she died, she had 19 continuous years of sobriety, but she had started to go to Alcoholics Anonymous almost 60 years before that. So um, I know that alcoholism is a progressive disease because I saw it as I watched my mother and I watched that disease. And I'm very grateful for that experience that I had with her because I think that when I first came into Alcoholics Anonymous and the old timers would talk about this being a progressive disease, I don't know that I necessarily would have been able to believe them. It doesn't seem to make sense that we could stop drinking for a significant period of time and that we wouldn't be better. So that, sure, if you're going to drink again, maybe things would get kind of bad again eventually. But the things that have seen with my mother and with several other people that I've cared about over the years is that the progression of this disease continues even while we're sober. Um, and so I'm very grateful for the old timers that were here when I got here. Because honestly, if they had said to me, if I go back out and drink when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, that I would have been dead in 6 months and they could have promised me that, I would have run out and kept drinking. What the old timers here told me is that if you're an alcoholic of the kind that we talk about in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous and the doctor's opinion, etc., then it's going to get worse, never better. And that being true, it can go on for years and years and years. And so I know the fact that I was able to hear that. I mean, how fortunate am I that I was able to hear that and that I was able to stay in Alcoholics Anonymous? I was not grateful when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous to be in Alcoholics Anonymous. Um, I was certainly not happy. I wasn't capable of being happy. I was filled with self pity. I was filled with self hatred. I did not believe that Alcoholics Anonymous could work for someone like me. I was sure I was too damaged. I was too broken. I'd had too many terrible things happen, and there was no way that it could heal. But I absolutely had no place else to go. No place else to go by the time I got here. My mother and I had a violent relationship when we were both drinking, and she wouldn't allow me to live in her house anymore. My family, I had a very small family, but they didn't even know where I was. And I didn't get in touch with any of them. I'd been in a lot of foster homes. None of them would take me back. I tried to get into some of the alcohol recovery homes that were available. There were very few. There were 3 that I knew of. I contacted all of them. None of them would take me, some because of my age and some just because of my attitude. And so I really, had no place else to go. I was walking down an alley, all 5 members of my own gang beat me up. And that's how I found myself sitting in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. I was 87 pounds. I had a black eye. I had a swollen lip. I didn't wear shoes because I'm from a beach town and had to have tough feet. That was an important requirement in my own mind anyway. And I raised my hand in the meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. I know today that there were some people in that meeting that did not know that we have the traditions that were read here tonight, and we read at most of our meetings. Because there were some people at that meeting that knew who I was and how old I was because my mother had been in and out of that group for about 10 years. But I'm sure they didn't know about the traditions because they came up to me after the meeting and they told me that they didn't want a little kid sitting in their meetings while they talked about serious things. And they told me if I came back, they'd get together and ask me to leave. And so I just thought AA didn't want me either. I didn't know that we have a third tradition that says the only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. But I didn't know that. I'm pretty sure they didn't know that either. And so I left that meeting and I went back to a friend of my mother's house. I went into her bathroom, which is the first place I went at any home I ever visited. I found enough of the kind of pills in that bathroom to kill myself, and I took enough of them to do it one more time. And before I passed out that day, I went to a noon meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And when I got there, they knew right away that I needed to be taken to a hospital. And that's where I came to. And a doctor gave me something to make me throw up. And a doctor explained to me that the pills I had taken were to slow down my heart. And had I been there 5 or 10 minutes later, I would have been in a coma that they probably could not have brought me out of. And I really cannot tell you exactly why that overdose was any different than all the other times that I had inflicted that on myself. But I know that it was different because I know that since that time, I have not taken anything that affects me from the neck up one day at a time. I've done that continuously since the 13th of July, 1972, which means that I've been continuously sober for 52 years and 11 months. Later this month, if I continue to do what I've been doing, I will celebrate 53 continuous years of sobriety in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, especially if you're new, I want to be sure that you know I never planned on staying sober 53 years. I didn't even want to live 6 months when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous. But I honestly tried to die while I was out there. I tried to die on a regular basis. I tried to take my own life. I tried to put myself in a position where someone else would take my life. I was trying to get out. And so the idea that I am still here, it absolutely amazes me. And it talks about in our literature, you will be amazed before you are halfway through. And I've been amazed for a very, very long time. I can't tell you when it first happened. It did not happen for me in the first months. As I said, I was not grateful. I was not happy. I was completely miserable. But I got commitments in Alcoholics Anonymous. And a big part of the reason I got commitments in Alcoholics Anonymous, I don't think the motives were particularly good. Some of my motives, I think, were the fact that I hated that I could not put $1 in that basket at the seventh tradition. My ego and my pride, even where I was, I hated that. And so somehow in my mind, I think I thought if I do $1 worth of work at the meeting, then maybe I'm not as big a loser as I felt like I was about not being able to throw that dollar in the basket. And I'll tell you, I know my ego well enough as I've stayed sober to know what a great blessing it was for me, because I know that I could have been one of those people who would have thrown $5 in the basket more than anybody else in my row just to show that I could. And then I would have missed out on all the service. And it has been one of the single most important things that has ever changed my life. So I'm very, very grateful now. But I wasn't at the time that I didn't have $1 to put in the basket. And I got commitments that are really kind of ridiculous. They really did not pick the best people when they gave me these commitments. One of my commitments was to be the greeter at this meeting. It was a pretty large meeting. I had, as I mentioned, I had just been beaten up by my own gang. So I had a black eye and I had a swollen lip. I had a jacket, and on the back it said, "Do unto others and then split." When I came to the program, I always held a cigarette in my hand. It was almost more of a weapon so that people would stay away, as well as something that I smoked. And after I'd been sober a short period of time, I took up smoking cigars and then a pipe because that also seemed to keep people away. I had a very limited vocabulary when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous. Primarily, it was profanity. There were a few exceptions, the and mother. And I knew that a lot of people would get very uncomfortable if I used that kind of language. And if they got too close to me, I would use that language. And there were literally times in a pretty good sized meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous where I was allowed to have an entire row all to myself. And I'm extremely grateful to the people in Alcoholics Anonymous who tolerated me and told me to keep coming back, even the way that I was, even the way that I acted. And I did get very active in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I went to 21 meetings a week. I got sober in Southern California and Los Angeles. So we were lucky enough that I had that availability to go to those meetings. I was not trying to get a gold star in AA. I had absolutely no place else to go that was indoors. And so all of my time in those first basically 2.5 years, I was on my way to a meeting. I was in a meeting. I was on my way from a meeting. I was walking to a meeting, hitchhiking to a meeting, taking a bus if I had enough money. And I usually did not have enough money. So I was, walking or hitchhiking. And I got a commitment as every one of those meetings, as I said, because I hated that I couldn't put the dollar in the basket. I've stayed active in Alcoholics Anonymous throughout the years that I've been sober in a lot of different ways. And I'm very grateful that we have so many different ways, to stay active. When I first got to Alcoholics Anonymous and I was standing there at the door as a greeter, there were a few people who knew how old I was, as I said, because they knew my mother. But the people who didn't know how old I was, they were guessing my age at 37. If you had asked me in 1972 to show you my birth certificate, it would have told you that I was 13 years old. And if you had asked me, I would have told you I'm 1,000 years old. And there's nothing in this meeting or this book or any of these things that people say or talk about here that can ever change. Because once you're 1,000 years old, you can't go back. And I really didn't think that I could. And yet, I can tell you tonight, and again, I can't tell you exactly when this happened, but I feel younger tonight than I did when I got sober in Alcoholics Anonymous almost 53 years ago. So that's a hell of a deal. Uh, I I do get to have the opportunity to go to the international this weekend, and I'm extremely grateful for that. I'm very happy that I'll be able to be a part of the celebration of Alcoholics Anonymous being 90 years old. You know, my grandfather, um, who was over in Ireland, when my grandfather was 46 years old, he was a drunk driver who was killed in his car, and so were other people in his car and in the car that he hit. And when my grandfather died at 46 years old, drunk, Alcoholics Anonymous did not exist anywhere. He left my grandmother with 13 children, one of whom was my father. And my father was to go on to drink himself to death alone in a hotel room before he was 50 years old. And when my father was born, Alcoholics Anonymous did not even exist. And when my mother was born, who I've mentioned was an alcoholic and was going to need Alcoholics Anonymous very much. But when my mother was born, Alcoholics Anonymous was less than a year old. And so I really think about those things, and I think about how fortunate I am to have been born in a time where Alcoholics Anonymous exists. How fortunate I was to come into Alcoholics Anonymous in 1972 and to meet so many of the original members of Alcoholics Anonymous who were very active and who were amazing and fabulous, storytellers. And when I was 3 years sober, through a bunch of different circumstances, I was able to get enough money together to go to the International Convention in 1975 in Denver. So I was 3 years sober. I got to go there. My memory is that there were 47 countries that were there. An international conventions, if you're new or if you don't really know about them, we hold them usually every 5 years to celebrate Alcoholics Anonymous. And at the international, because it's for the whole world, the countries who come, they are invited to have one person carry the flag and represent the flag for that country. And at that international, they do it a little bit differently now, or they have the last few that I've been to. But at that international, they had each person who carried a flag come up to the microphone on the opening night and say in their own language, "Let it begin with me." And I don't think that, I'll ever forget the emotions that were just everywhere in that room with 20,000 people. I'm not sure. I think it was 27,000 that were at that particular one. I got to hear Lois Wilson share. I've been very, very fortunate, that I got to hear and meet some of the early members, of Alcoholics Anonymous and early friends of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm very grateful that I stayed, that I stayed sober. I know that, one of the things that I heard actually more, I think, during Zoom than I remember hearing it specifically, but that really hit me was someone who was talking about, don't let the life that AA gives you take you away from AA. And it really hit me because I've been sober long enough to see so many people let so many gifts take them away from Alcoholics Anonymous. But it also made me realize, and believe me, that was during the pandemic. So that's like in the last 5 years, which, I want to just point out means that I'm still learning things. Because at that point, I was over 45 years sober when I heard someone really say that. And I realized that partly because of some of the horrible difficulties that I had in those early years of my sobriety, financial and otherwise, that kept me close to Alcoholics Anonymous. I didn't have a, a career. I could barely support myself. I barely had a place to live in those early years. So I didn't get caught up in a career that was giving me a promotion where I was getting a bigger life. I didn't, Prince Charming didn't come galloping up on a white horse and carry me off, to a castle. So I didn't get distracted. I had instead a series of really disturbing, upsetting relationships, if you want to even call them relationships, in those early years of my sobriety. And so I needed Alcoholics Anonymous, more than ever. Um, I want to go ahead and I'll tell you a couple of stories and then I'm going to stop. Let me see where I am here. Okay. So, one of the things that happened at that international, I like to tell this story. We had a guy and he was sober less than 5 years more than I was. So he had 5 years and I had three. And, uh, and so that year in Los Angeles, that's where he was from. Um, a year before, he thought, this international is in Denver. And Denver this is the way I remember it. Again, I could be a little off, but Denver was like 16-hour drive, maybe 18-hour drive from Los Angeles, which is, pretty far. But he thought, that's really kind of doable. It's not really that far or that hard. And so he decided to try to help 40 people from Los Angeles be able to go to the International, which was celebrating the 40th year of Alcoholics Anonymous. And he was trying to help them do it for $40. So the only way you could do it was you'd have to camp. There's no way you could, even back then, you couldn't stay in hotels, even sharing hotels, there was no way. So he arranged, he got borrowed equipment from people and he got some cars arranged and they all met at one of our clubs in California to do this drive. And he just had them all set up and he had booked all the, campsites and stuff ahead. So he had everybody meet at the club and they had to meet at midnight because they were driving across the desert and most of these were alcoholic cars. And so they didn't have air conditioning and it was chancy whether they were going to make it anyway. So they all met up and they were going to caravan. And then, whoever showed up, they just put them in whatever cars as they came in and they all kind of drove up. And, while they were standing there getting all the cars organized and putting people in, a drunk guy came because it was a meeting room that had usually a midnight meeting. And he showed up and he's like, how you doing? And they said, great. They go, what are you doing? He goes, we're going to a convention. I want to go to a convention. So they threw him in one of the cars and they drove off across the desert. And they stopped in a place called Beaver, Utah. And because that was kind of a halfway point, it was an inexpensive camping site. So they got there and after they got all set up, in the morning, they all set up their tents and, whatever. And then they got a little nap and then they went to the local meeting in Beaver, Utah that night. And the local meeting in Beaver, Utah, there was a guy and he was sitting there. He sat there every week and sometimes people came, but most of the time nobody did. And so he sat there and he had a coffee pot and he had a big book and he sat there. And that particular night, 41 people came to his meeting and he just had a great time. And Don, my friend, was, the one who was organizing this whole thing. He wasn't my friend then, but he became my friend anyway. And so this guy at the Beaver, Utah meeting, he begged Don. He goes, Don, please promise me that you'll come back. Promise me that you'll bring these people back. I've never had anything so exciting happen. And so Don made a promise and Don started a conference. It's still going. It's in Beaver, Utah. It's held usually in September, I think during Labor Day weekend. And it's a camp out in Beaver, Utah, and they only celebrate 1-year birthdays at that conference. And at that first conference, they celebrated the 1 year of the guy who had climbed into the van who was drunk, and he is still sober today. So you never know. And I love the fact that Don only had, less than 5 years sober, and he just thought of something fun to do in Alcoholics Anonymous. And he was able to, pass on the gift of sobriety that had been given freely to him. Um, anyway, let's see here. Where am I going to go? Well, there's absolutely no way that I can tell you about how my life has changed in 53 years in the next few minutes that I'm going to be allowed here. And so, what I want to go ahead and tell you is first, I'll tell you about how I was sitting in that meeting in the early days. And I want to set this timer and make sure I've got it going there. Okay, I got it going to, there we go. Okay, so when I'm sitting in that meeting where I was the greeter one night, and I had less than 30 days, there was a woman who was speaking, and it turned out that her name was Sybil. And she was the first woman to get sober west of the Mississippi. She'd gotten sober in 1941 after reading the Jack Alexander article. She had 31 or 32 years that night. She was obviously older than I was. I was 13. And she was up there and she was going to talk for a very long time, maybe even longer than I'm talking tonight. And she was going on, and she was happy. So there was really no reason for me to listen to somebody like this because I could not relate to happy people. It's a woman, she's 30 years old, 50 years older than me. There's really no point. So I was thinking about myself. Sadly, something I still do sometimes in meetings, but that particular night I definitely was. And I had a lot of problems when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, as I suppose most of us do. So I was thinking about these problems and how they were unsolvable. And she began to talk and finished. At the end of her talk, she said, and newcomers. And I thought, oh, this is about me. So I started to listen. She said, now, newcomers, she said, I have an amazing life. She said, it's really unbelievable, the life that I have. I don't even know how to put it into words. She said, and do you know, newcomers, if I had a magic wand and I could wave that wand and I could give you an amazing life, she said, I wouldn't do it. And I thought, whoa, that's not the way I thought the story was going to go. I mean, I'm from the streets of Venice. I know there aren't magic wands, but I figured the AA thing would be to at least say, oh, newcomers, I wish I could. I wish I could make your life better. She didn't even want to. I mean, it was just mean. She said, I wouldn't do it. She said, I wouldn't do it because I wouldn't want to rob you of the journey. Now, when I sat there in that meeting that night, I want to let you know I had no place to live. I had no one that was talking to me. I had no money. I had a 7th grade education. I did not have a job. I was facing court cases. I was illegally in the country. I was born in Canada. Happy Canada Day. And, there was absolutely nothing that I could see good happening in my life. And I did not want a journey. I wanted something to just make it all better. But of course, here I am, almost 53 years later. And I can tell you, I'm sure glad she couldn't rob me of my journey. And then, of course, as you stay sober, you learn nobody can rob you of your journey except you. It's your journey. And in my experience in Alcoholics Anonymous, there has always been someone who has been willing to help and to share with me how they have walked and trudged the road of happy destiny. I know that that would be true for you if you're willing to reach out and ask for help. I want to let you know when I got sober in 1972, I would have traded places with anybody on the planet. I did not believe there was anybody on the planet who had ever had a worse life than I had. And I got to tell you, I can't tell you when, but it's been a very long time now since I have seriously been willing to even entertain the idea of trading places with anybody. I am overpaid by the amazing life that I have had here in Alcoholics Anonymous. And if you're new, I hope that you'll stay close and I hope you'll find out what the miracles are that are in your life. Thanks for letting me be part of your group.